And thank you for joining us here on PM Express. Tonight, a conversation that we're going to have a lot of in a year of elections with just 5 months to go. We're looking at the election 2020, promoting responsible manifestos for inclusive development, a look at Ghana's economy. And we're grateful to the CDD for making this conversation possible. I want to go through some of the key things for you. Now, the growing political importance of election manifestos, of course, cannot be understated. Within the context of Ghana's elections, it's become such an important document each time we are going into an elections. And one of the key things that we know is a key for most political parties in any elections has to do with what the manifestos promise and what they offer to people. If you speak to experts, they believe that election 2020 offers us the opportunity to prioritize and address some of the structural governance and development challenges that a country faces. That is how important they believe that a manifesto is. Now, there's no doubt that, despite the importance of the manifesto was both a campaign and a governing document. The manifesto over the years from, agenda setting, state implementation, remained a document for party elites. And if you know anything about the manifestos, it's people like us who talk about this. But for the people down there, it's pretty inaccessible to them. But I guess it's time to change that particular challenge with the manifestos. Now, for the potential value of the manifestos to be realized, experts suggest the current politics and the political economy around campaign manifestos must be, as I say, disrupted in a deliberate and constructive way. And this is what the CDD initiative is attempting to do. Place far more value in the substance of the manifestos and the way that people can appreciate, so we can have a more valuable document than what it has been in the past. Now, if you again talk to the CDD, they believe that a CSO-led intervention designed to address these identified gaps in the manifesto value chain, as they call it, from agenda setting, pre-campaign, post-release campaign to implementation as opposed to elections, is absolutely critical to making Ghana's election manifestos and government policies and programs responsive. It is so key when we are talking about manifestos. It's almost become like a formality. But that's what guides the governments when they are in power, because they know 4 years on they'll be judged by what they did and how they managed to implement their manifestos. And so holding them and making sure the manifestos are address these gaps is so important, because if you fail to input at this stage and they win power and they come in with a defective manifesto, we are in trouble. And that is why the CDD believes this is a conversation that we must have. And we're going to have a series of these conversations as we gear up towards December 7. Don't joke with the manifesto. The MPP has shown us with free SHS, one district, one factory, one district, one constituency, $1 million, and all the other things they promised, that when they get into power, they must find every means possible to push through what they have promised, even if the reality suggests that, yes, you promised it, but the reality may suggest do something else. Because they have promised it, they must necessarily do it. They must put all the money and resources into fulfilling their manifestos. But is that what manifestos are meant to do? And how do you get it to address the real needs and make it a document that serves the people if parties win power? That's a conversation we're going to have in a series of shows starting tonight. Stay with us. My guests will join me shortly, and then we'll begin to have this conversation. Very interesting. Stay with me. And thank you very much for joining us here on PM Express. And I must say that we want to acknowledge the Center for Democratic Development, the CDD, is the implementer of this particular project, an opportunity to interrogate some of these very important issues as we approach the 2020 elections, which is just 5 months away. And also DFID, who also, of course, partnering with the CDD to make this possible. And I'm particularly excited about this because if you followed our electoral history, manifestos over the years increasingly have become such an important document. And in the last 3 years, we've seen this play out more so because of the big line item free SHS. And then when it comes to sponsoring it, the MPP wanted to roll it out just the way they promised it. But the many civil society organizations have said the reality dictates that you amend it slightly. But they insisted we went to the people with the document and they voted for us based on the document. Why do you want to change it now that they've given you the mandate based on that document? And that will be almost deceiving the people. And so we're going to go ahead exactly the way we had planned it. That raises so many questions. It tells you how important that document is. If you miss it during this time, you probably would deal with it for the rest of a government's term. So we're going to have a series of these conversations. And tonight, to look at the various aspects from the jobs question to the economic question, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor William Barboate. He's the Associate Professor of Economics and Head of Economic Department, University of Ghana. We'll also be joined via on Zoom by Professor Achua Megashi. He's a fellow at the CDD Ghana and Professor of Economics of University of Gulf in Canada. In fact, he joins us via Zoom. Prof, thank you very much for joining us from I'm guessing you are still in Canada, correct? I think you've muted your microphone so we can hear you. But I have Professor William Barboate in the studio with me, and I must say
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I could hear you. Yes, I could hear you.
Okay.
And you were telling me you are in Canada, correct?
Yes, I'm in Canada. I'm in Guelph, which is 1 hour from Toronto.
Okay, great. Great city there in Toronto. Now, Prof. Barboate, let me start with you on this. So let's start with the intriguing question of jobs, for example, right? We have a case study that we could look at. The NPP's manifesto had a theme. The whole document was themed change, an agenda for jobs. So if you look at it as a document, 3 years on, what does it tell? Are we learning anything from that? What does it tell you in terms of your analysis of how important the document is to delivering on socio-economic change for people?
Well, thank you, Evans. I would have loved that the document would have been titled Agenda for Employment.
Okay.
Because I've said it several times that when you go to Europe and you talk about jobs, it's the same as employment.
Okay.
Because, I mean, the economy is well structured, more formal. But when you come to our part of the world, jobs are not the same as employment. And therefore, you may be able to create jobs, as it were, but doesn't necessarily mean that people have been employed. And another point that we need to learn from the document and also its implementation is that we still haven't learned from our mistakes in the past. Because you cannot put a document together without looking at research. And in Ghana, that has been the bane. We don't back our documents with research. And research also comes with data. And therefore, if you want to know where we are, you need to look at the data. And if you want to know how you've done, and we have to also look at data. And it seems that over the years, when it comes to investing in data collection, especially in employment and stuff like that, I think we haven't done well. And it's not only in Ghana, let me put it that way. Many African countries haven't done quite well. I mean, we are all here, and we can say that about 40 million people have filed for unemployment in the US. And it shows that the labor market is well structured. And therefore, everybody who is working, I mean, majority of them pay taxes. I mean, they have their TIN. I mean, if I can borrow from Ghana and so on. So just looking at just at the bottom of the computer, you'll be able to know that during the COVID, this number of people could not pay taxes because they've been laid off. When you come to our part of the world, it's more informal. And therefore, we need to invest in data collection to be able to know the impact or effect of any policy that we implement. So it becomes very difficult to assess based on it. Currently, you can only resort to the most recent data on employment, dated back to 2017. And I think it's good, but 3 years, it becomes very difficult. And we can't do more. So if I have to assess it, when it comes to implementation, we haven't actually learned our lessons to be able to invest more in the data. And we also have to understand the concept. And you understand the concept more when you are able to resort to research. And that is what I think as a country we need to look at.
It's a very interesting thing we'll come back to about what goes into drafting this document. Will be very key as we dive into this. Let me bring in Professor Achua Megashi into this. Prof, you wrote a paper, Fiscal Management and Consolidation in Ghana. In that document, you articulate, in essence, some of the key issues that an economy like Ghana should pay attention to. I wonder what your take is at a time like this when we are going to go through another cycle of a context of ideas, I guess, about which approach is best suited to help us deal with fiscal management and consolidation. And people are going to be making decisions on which of the policy alternatives is best suited to deliver on these in this particular aspect. What's your, based on the research and the article you did, putting in the context of an election going into another election context by ideas, what would you say in terms of how important it is to get it right at this time before even we vote?
Could you please ask, what do you mean by to get it right?
I mean, to get the context for the policy formulation around how to best deal with the fiscal management and the consolidation of some of these key issues that you touched on. Parties are going to be formulating policies, right, around this at this time, based on which they will come to me and say, vote for me. This is time to get it right, I guess. And policy formulators and thinkers like yourself will have to, I guess, play a part in shaping that narrative going into an election. I mean, I'm just trying to get you to emphasize for me how important, how important it is at this time to get that right, that process into finalizing a document right.
Okay, I understand your question now. So it's obviously important to make sure that you have the right policy in place. That's pretty much an obvious point. But it also means that you have to approach it seriously, where you have the data that goes into informing the policy formulation. It also means that you have to learn from history. You have to learn from policies that have been practiced elsewhere or even within Ghana in the past, and to be able to evaluate how well they've worked. Like, for example, if you take the free SHS, it's been implemented, it's a good policy, but we know it has challenges. So you can learn from that, and then you try to recalibrate what you are exactly doing. The other thing, though, is that it is not it's not necessarily a question of ideas. Sometimes it's a question of how to effectively implement the policy, right? It's a question of how to be committed to the policy and follow it through and to implement it. So both have to go together. The ideas have to be there. They are very good on paper, but you have to implement them as well. So I get the import of your question. It is very important to get things right at the policy formulation stage. If you don't, then if you try to implement a bad policy, is much harder to do than if you try to implement a good policy.
Okay. What was your take on that in terms of that process?
Well, I think I will go back to the same point about making sure that the formulation is done very well and emphasize that it must be backed by what is on the ground, the research. And if you don't know what is on the ground, you are going to formulate policies that will not answer the question. I will give you a typical example. I have read a number of papers that still talks about the fact that agriculture is the main source of employment in Ghana.
Is it not?
Which is not true.
Interesting.
The data doesn't say that.
Really?
Many people don't even know that the concept of employment has changed. If you take data on employment from 1991 up to 2013, the concept of employment was equated to work. Mm-hmm. The ILO after 2013 realized that there are some people who are working but are not employed because the economic activity that they are engaged in doesn't feed into GDP. For instance, if I stay in my village and I have a farm, I go to the farm, I have my pepper, tomatoes, whatever, I go there, I get my tomatoes, go home, use it, and I don't send anything to the market. Mm-hmm. In calculating GDP, that will not be captured because it is subsistence. So based on that, if you are working for own use, it's not part of employment. So you see that they have changed. Mm. And therefore, if you look at employment figures from even 2010, you read that the services sector is the dominant sector in terms of employment. Mm-hmm. So if you formulate policies and say that agriculture is the dominant sector in employment, you've gotten it wrong from the start.
Okay.
And that is very, very important.
Because so if you get that wrong, then I guess the ultimate formulation of the policy also, because it's based on a faulty foundation.
Exactly. So that is very, very important. So I agree with my colleague. The formulation is important, but you need to get the data right. You need to get the concept right. And you need to know why, because that is why planning and all those stuff are very important. But many a time, we look at what the population is saying and see that, well, we need this, therefore let's put this into the manifesto. I think this one will work. Let's do this. This one will do that. At the end of the day, you realize that it becomes very difficult to be able to achieve what you intended to achieve.
I mean, Professor Megashi, we're talking about promoting responsible and responsive manifestos for inclusive development. I want you first to lay out for me broadly what are the key issues of importance to you? Or what are the issues you want to prioritize as a researcher yourself when you look at responsive and responsible manifestos, broadly?
Okay, so like based on the paper I did, I think one of the main things is to be fiscally responsible, mm-hmm. right? And so that's quite obvious. Reduce expenditure and boost revenue. Our tax revenue as a proportion of GDP is quite low. The IMF shares is 12.8% or around 13%, and it's below the sub-Saharan average of 50%. But even more importantly, the countries who give us aid, like US, Germany, the OECD countries, their proportion is about 33%. So tax revenue as a proportion of GDP is about 33%. Denmark, for example, is around 40%, and we are like 12.8%. So that means that we have a tight fiscal space. We can't do certain things. We don't collect enough tax revenue. And of course, as we know, that is connected to the informal sector or the informal nature of our economy, where I think in November 2017, the Director General of GRA, Mr. Kofinski, said that only 1.2 million Ghanaians pay income taxes. Okay, that's income tax. That's different from VAT. VAT, most people pay, but income tax is only 1.2 million Ghanaians out of a country where, let's say, the labor force is close to maybe at least 15 million. So we have a lot of tax. We don't collect enough taxes, and then we have to also try to reduce expenditure. So if you don't, without that, you would find that a policy like free SHS becomes difficult to implement because it's facing challenges. So taxation and also responsible expenditure, being fiscally transparent and responsible, is the key cornerstone of development that has been documented. So the countries that are the rich countries, they tax more and they spend responsibly too. That's why there's something called no taxation without representation, right? You can't tax me and not be responsible. I have to be represented. I have to be at the table. So that's a very important thing. We have to get our fiscal house in order. When you have a fiscal house in order, many other things will be in place. Then you can do so many things. You can provide public goods. You can fund roads, hospitals, education. For example, during this COVID pandemic, one reason why we couldn't implement the lockdown was because one reason we didn't have the resources to feed the people affected adversely by the lockdown. And we also didn't have a good database to identify who to give the transfers to. That was one reason. So it affects our capacity to implement policy. So I think that's one thing we have to deal with.
Yes. Prof.
Yes. I think let me touch on my colleague's point on taxation. And I think he quoted the IMF and said that we have 12.8% in terms of tax to GDP. I think I always say that we need to look at some of these figures very well. Because if you go to the GRA, the tax figures that they take are those that are captured at the macro level. I think he mentioned that we don't tax the informal sector. But I think we need to look at our economy and see what is the structure of the economy. I have said it several times that everybody in Ghana pays tax, so long as you buy goods and services. And if you take our tax structure, indirect tax account for about 60%. So that's
huge.
That's indirect tax. Because the port...
Because that sort of thing catches everybody in the net.
Exactly. So even my mother who doesn't work, the moment my mother bought a taxi or a trotro and paid trotro fare, it goes into the taxes on fuel.
And they say that's 60%.
Yes, that is indirect tax.
Okay,
The direct tax, which is corporate tax and income tax.
Okay.
But when you go to advanced countries, and my senior colleague will tell you, the direct tax in Canada will form a greater proportion of the total tax revenue than the indirect tax. So when you juxtapose it here, you may say that many Ghanaians don't pay tax, but that may not necessarily be the case, because taxes that are collected at a district level, do they find themselves in the calculation of total taxes in Ghana? Does it? No, it doesn't. If you go to Adenta municipality, I mean hairdressers, I mean seamstresses, tailors, I mean you go to the market, kayais, they pay some tolls. Where does that money go? So you are looking at the total tax. Perhaps if we are able to account for all those that go to the disassemblies and those that leak out, if we are able to account for that, perhaps 12.8 may not be 12.8. So that is why many a time we say that we have fiscal space, and therefore let's widen the tax net. But we have said this since 1980, but we've not been able to widen it. Because when we widen it and you go to the market, these market people are paying before they even start. So we need to look at the structure very well. So if it is GRA that is providing all the tax data, then it must also account for those taxes that are collected at the local level, so that even however small it is, we'll be able to know that all these people pay tax. Now in the informal sector, how do they pay income tax? You need to assess their income. And if you don't put measures in place to be able to assess their income, then you'll not be able to know whether they pay tax. For all you know, if you assess it, perhaps they are making losses. And therefore you may not even be able to. So the moment we look at the macro level, the IMF says that no, we have fiscal space, let's expand the tax. We will still come back the following year and know that we will not be able to realize it. Another point is exemptions. In Ghana, we are noted for exemptions. I have said that many a time, if somebody is supposed to be given exemption, let the person pay the tax upfront and then apply for exemption so that it is not going to be abused. So if you look at exemptions and many people are taking out money out of it, you get your 12.8% to be very low. So there are many leakages that are in the system that make tax revenue so low. So the moment we say let's expand it, that the elastic is still has been stretched to a certain limit. But the problem is within. And if you are able to plug the leakages, you see that we'll be able to raise more money without expanding the tax. And I expect in the manifesto, that will capture those kind of stuff.
But it's very interesting. I want to bring in Professor Achomegachi. You started this conversation on this note, which we're talking about taxes here, and I think both of you agree that the net isn't wide enough, right? And you've talked about, Professor Babwat, you've talked about how you want the manifesto to be more rigorous. But the reverse is, the manifesto is almost like a spending document, like my plan to spend. But I wonder how that plan factors in what both of you have talked about, which is the fiscal discipline, one. Also bearing in mind the reality that we are not raising enough revenue in this country consistently over the last many years. The biggest challenge in our budgets has been constantly we are spending more than we are raising in revenue. But it doesn't appear to me, and Professor Megashi, to you this question comes, it doesn't appear to me that our policy formulators or the political minds who are preparing these documents seem to factor that into the equation. They only get into government and then they tell us, well, we aren't raising enough, and so we can't meet the expectations, although they promised us. What's your comment and observation on that, Prof. Megashi?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I agree with what my colleague Professor Babwat said. That's a very good point. So I've told some friends in the past that in Ghana, you don't have right-wing and left-wing parties. There's nothing like that. So some people think the MPP is the right-wing, and then there's nothing like that. So it's not like in the US or the UK where you say the Conservative Party will be talking about reducing taxes, and then the left-wing party will be talking about increasing taxes and so forth. So in Ghana, you're right. They all spend. And the reason why expenditure goes up is some of the expenditure is frivolous, and some too is important because we have a huge development gap, or what has been known as an infrastructure gap to make for the infrastructure deficit. But so in a sense, so what Professor Babwat was saying about exemptions, and that is so if you reduce exemptions, indirectly you are increasing tax. So when they are in opposition or when they are campaigning, even in the rich countries, nobody likes an increase in tax. Nobody wants to hear, well, we're going to increase your tax. Mm-hmm. So they're very careful about that, or they don't say that at all. They don't say, it's when they win power, that's when they start increasing tax. So one reason is if there's trust in government and there's fiscal transparency, sometimes it's easier to say I'm going to increase taxes than because the people believe that if you do come into power, you are going to spend your money judiciously or wisely, right? So that's that thing we have to work on. If the politicians can be committed to being fiscally responsible. So on that score, I would commend something like the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Yeah, that was passed. And in my paper, I point out some loopholes in that.
What are the loopholes? Because it's important now. We are in a phase where we need to be interrogating everything. So it's a good thing, but there are two loopholes that I can identify. One loophole says that under certain circumstances, the Minister of Finance can suspend the fiscal responsibility rule, the constraints, okay? And the circumstances are if like there's a pandemic, if there's a natural disaster, mm-hmm. or anything of the sort, okay? So that's understandable. So the finance minister can do that because these are events outside the control of politicians. They are what we might call exogenous events. The loophole is that in addition to those events, they've added that if the growth of GDP is less than 1%, the rule can be suspended. But that is not, you see, the growth of GDP being less than 1% is not necessarily an event that will be outside your control. It could be within your control, that it's your mismanagement that resulted in the GDP growth being less than 1%. Right? So if you do that, then anybody can misgovern and say, oh, we had a bad situation, so let's not follow this fiscal rule. Mm-hmm. Or tax revenue was too low this year,
laws not follow this fiscal rule. It could be that the tax revenue was low because you were incompetent or you were inefficient. That's one point. The other point is that the rule places a cap on the debt as a on the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP.
Yeah.
So it says the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP can't be more than 5%. But the fiscal deficit has two components. It has a primary balance. So the primary balance is your revenue minus your expenditure, where expenditure does not include interest rate payments and debt. Okay, so the fiscal balance is the primary balance plus, and then you take into account interest rate payments. Now, although the fiscal responsibility rule puts a cap on fiscal balance as a proportion of GDP, it doesn't put a cap on the primary balance. It just says the primary balance has to be positive. So if the difference between tax revenue and tax revenue and expenditure, less interest rate payments, if that difference is 1 CD, that satisfies the law. If that difference is 50 CDs, that satisfies the law. So there has to be a rule which says that, look, this primary surplus, which is supposed to be positive, it doesn't have to be only positive. It has to be, let's say, X% of GDP. So it has to be specified what percentage it has to be. It doesn't have that in the law. So that's a flaw in the law. There's a weakness in the law.
So we have a challenge. You agree that the fiscal is a good act itself, and we've seen in coronavirus times that the finance was in Parliament and is asking that some aspects of the act be shelved for now, because obviously GDP is 1.5, shrunk significantly from around 6 or 7 projected. But isn't that the problem though? Because if the laws that we pass, and Professor Gashi hits a nail on the head, laws that we pass to control fiscal discipline, for which reason most often than not, we are unable to create more jobs because the economy is not performing well. All those other challenges that we see in the economy is as a result of our ability we spend more than we earn. But we have laws that have been built to try and correct that, but the laws themselves have been, because politicians create the law, right? They build in the mechanisms that allow them to circumvent it, right? And then they go on to this promising spree, knowing very well that these loopholes can be exploited.
Well, I think he has said it all. I mean, if you look at the Act, there are certain loopholes, and of course they put the laws there. And I mean, for instance, if you are in pandemic and then you need to spend, and the law will just prevent you, it becomes very difficult for you to save the population. So by all means, you will have to find some ways around it, which becomes very difficult. And many senior colleagues will tell you that, well, you are talking economics, but in that particular function, objective function, there is politics in there, and you need to maximize that element as well. So many a time we have the economic, but political economy is also as important as the real economic. So that is the challenge that we have. But he said something which is very striking. I mean, nobody wants to pay tax. So if you put in the manifesto that I'm going to increase taxes, I'm going to abolish exemptions, I mean, people will just look at you and say, well, this guy is going to take our daily bread from us. But you can also do it in such a way that it will not be so visible that you are going to increase tax. Because if you try to ensure efficient revenue collection, I mean, that is also a way of raising the revenue part of the budget. For instance, and I will still look at the informal sector part. If you are able to digitize, and I was very happy when I read the Vice President was trying to digitize all these and so on and so forth. And somebody is supposed to pay property tax through by digital means. It moves the human aspect. So the money will hit where it's supposed to. So it means we solved the first part of the problem. The money has gotten to where it's supposed to. Then you come to how the spending is going to be. But if you have a double kind of problem, where the money itself is being leaked out, but then the expenditure is going up, then you have a problem. So we, the populace, would not have that control because the act or the bill will be passed by Parliament and all of them are there as politicians and so on. And you expect that they are also going to manage it.
Yeah.
And it becomes very difficult. And can they supervise themselves and ensure that when it matters most, they will just tie their own hands? I mean, that's the human nature. But we still should be able to look at the nation and say that, well, we need to look at the other side, just tame down expenditure. And he used the word frivolous expenditure and get the revenue out, and we'll be able to balance.
But here's the trick, and I like this conversation because talking about manifestos and how to get it right. Don't we see the indication? If you talk about frivolous expenditure,
yeah.
But don't you see that already in the document they'll be selling to us in an attempt to get our votes? Because you look at the document, it tells you all the things they'll be spending our monies on if you elect them.
Yes.
So my question is, should we wait till they get elected before we start asking questions about this expenditure is frivolous, or this is the time to be proactive from civil society, media, etc.? And I guess this is why we're having this conversation, yes. You know, and looking closely at what they are going to be promising and pointing out which ones are frivolous and which ones are not, bearing in mind our revenue reality.
Well, society can look at the manifesto and point out all those things. But remember, the manifesto is supposed to achieve something.
Yeah.
The main objective is to be elected.
Okay.
And who are going to elect them? The populace. And therefore, if the populace wants something in the manifesto that says that when I come to power, I'm going to pay everybody, regardless of whether you are working or not, I'm going to pay you thousands of cedis a month. That person thinks that that is the best way for him, and he's going to vote. So first and foremost, what is the manifesto seeking to achieve? It's seeking to get people's vote. And you need to say something that will attract the people to vote for you.
Yeah.
So the people will not just take the manifesto and scrutinize it and say, no, it's not going to be possible. But they will just look at it and say, what he told me, I know he was going to do it. But when you come to power and you're not able to do it, that is a different ballgame altogether. So we have to look at the objective of the manifesto, because that is what we are selling to the people. And everybody has one vote. So somebody may need road. Somebody may say that, what is road? I mean, I want something to eat and you are telling me road. Because the road is used by everybody. But I want something that will come to me. So we have different objective functions. But then the politician will look at where he will get most of the votes and then tailor the manifesto to get that vote. And that is one thing that we have to bear in mind. We are talking as researchers, academics, and so on. But the objective of the manifesto must also be put in perspective.
Professor Megashi, what would you say is the best way then to control this horse called spending for a government? I mean, we've tried many things and it appears it hasn't really worked. And let me just point out something that I observed. Almost every government comes and they spend at least minimum the first 3 years trying to stabilize the macro economy before they begin to do anything. It's almost like a cycle. After every election, we hear we are broke, right? So I want to hear from you, if you may, how do we fix that challenge of, because it's about spending, right? Controlling the spending. What are your recommendations? We've talked about the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but even there you pointed out the defects. So what works?
Okay, so Amy, to pick it back on your previous question on manifestos, a manifesto would have some limits in terms of the fact that it can't be specific enough, right? So, for example, when President Nado was in opposition, he talked about his free SHS, but it was not. It was a broad idea he had. He had some specifics, but it was after he got in government that he was able to really fine-tune it, right? And it still has some problems. So a manifesto by its nature will still have some loose ends that would have to be fixed when they get into power. But the other thing you were talking about is you were asking about how to control expenditure?
Spending, yes, which has been our bane.
Okay, you see, one thing about politicians is that, well, they have a conscience, they try to do the right thing, but what tells them to do the right thing the most is electoral accountability, right? Okay. The risk of being voted out is one of the things that incentivizes them. So civil society have to speak up and to show that. So on certain issues, we shouldn't have. It doesn't have to be an NDC, MPP issue. Civil society and the populace have to agree on some broad things. That look, this thing is obviously bad. We should not condone it. The other thing too is I want to move to something that is connected to expenditure, but not quite. Mm-hmm. Has to do with like when Professor Babwatson talks about creating, let's say, creating jobs and how to grow the economy or stabilize the economy. See, there's something you talked about stabilizing macro indicators, right? And we know that there's something in economics called growth without development. That is, you can have all the indicators working, but you don't see development in certain things, in certain areas, either the hospitals or schools, but you have growth, right? Because you can have growth fueled by oil or growth fueled by cocoa. But if you don't consume cocoa, then what is that growth amounting to? You don't consume cocoa, you use the revenue from cocoa. So one thing, for example, in Ghana, is like land title. Why is it that in the year 2020, the average Ghanaian can't buy land and just have peace of mind that they have title to the land?
Yeah.
Right. So you see, so that's something really basic. And I've heard stories of people chasing land title for 10 years. Now, such a system is such an inefficient system, and it's a cost to doing business that it stunts economic growth. Right? It holds you may not recognize, but it holds the economy back. That in a country, you can't just buy land, go to land department, or do the legal stuff, and sleep peacefully because you don't have title to the land. No. After 6 years, somebody comes around and says, you have to pay this one to get a title, or somebody's claiming ownership of the land. So this is a signal of a fundamental inefficiency, that a country that cannot correct such inefficiency cannot grow. And if you can't grow, you can't raise more taxes, and then everything gets out of whack. Right? But as for the expenditure part that you asked, politicians have to be held accountable, right? Yeah. For example, I believe that the size of the government is too large.
Yeah.
Right. You see, yes. But I can say this, but I can't compel the president to reduce the number of ministers that he has. I can't compel him to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm a Ghanaian, you're a Ghanaian. I can't compel, but if he knows that maybe he might lose an election, he might act differently. That's not to say that his opponents will not do the same thing. So it's a very challenging area that it's not easy to navigate.
I'm going to take a quick break. When I return, I'll get Professor Babwatson's take on what you just had there, but also talk about a point that Professor Megashi also touched on, inclusivity in the question of growth. That is also key, right? And also, how do we get our parties in drafting these policy documents, call it a manifesto, to think about the question of inclusivity, making the document inclusive? Stay with me. Still with us here on PMS, and I'm grateful that you could still stay with us, because as we build up 2020, these conversations will be important, so that one, we can have an informed electorate that could hold the politicians to account in some of the things they promise, both out there on the campaign trail, but also in what they put in their manifestos generally, understanding its implications when it comes to governance. And so I'm delighted that Professor William Babwatson, Associate Professor of Economics and Head of the Economics Department, University of Ghana, is with us, and Professor Achua Megashi is also Fellow of the CDD Ghana and Professor of Economics, University of Guelph, Canada, is also with us via Zoom. And I just want to quickly say again that much appreciation to CDD, the Center for Democratic Development, they implementing this particular project with sponsorship from the DFID, making this possible. And I guess I say that this year is all about creating an informed electorate. That's a way to get the best out of our government. Professor Bambaten, there's something that Professor Atuamegashi touched on just before we went for the break about growth without development. It brings the question about inclusivity, okay, in these documents, these policy documents that the politicians tend to formulate. What's your assessment of that?
I think all of us are moved by the figure that we get. I mean, we grew by this, the country grew by this, but the growth must transcend to reflect on the life of the people. Even at the basic level of economics, we look at GDP growth, look at per capita GDP, and we tell you that it is not a very good measure of welfare. So when we become so fussy about the growth rates a country is recording and comparing it with other countries and say that we are the fastest growing economy, without looking at the source of growth, does not make it inclusive. And growth will be more inclusive if the people take part in the growth process, because the benefit will be spread across those who were part of the growth. So if you have an economy where growth is driven by natural resources, let's say oil, and in Ghana we grew by 14% in 2011.
We were the fastest growing economy in the world at that time.
Yes, because of the oil.
Yeah.
So how many people in that country took part directly in the production of oil, such that the benefit was spread to them? If growth comes from, let's say, agriculture, we know that at least we have about 38% of people employed in agriculture. So if growth comes from there, then you expect that the benefit will also come to them. If you take our growth right now, the informal sector accounts for 28% of total growth, of total GDP in 2019. And they account for 84 or 85% of total employment. So if you are taking part in the growth process and what you come out with is 28.5%, then you spread 28.5% among the 85% that you have. So then many people will not benefit as much as the growth.
What does the evidence say? Is our growth exclusive or inclusive?
Our growth, I wouldn't say exclusive, but our growth is not inclusive enough.
Okay, it's not enough, okay.
It's not inclusive enough because Ghana Statistical Service own data shows that GDP, the informal sector contributes 28.5% to total GDP. But then in terms of employment, they are about 85%. So you see that, and of course you benefit from growth if you take part in the growth. And we have to look at calculation of GDP. Expenditure, government expenditure is a major one. So if government spends on something that will not benefit the people directly, it goes into the calculation of the GDP, and the growth rate becomes so high, but then the people will not get that kind of benefit. If you look at manufacturing, which is one of the highest labor absorption sectors, it does not perform well the way it is, because that is where many people are. Therefore, they don't benefit from the growth. And if growth is also, like if you are looking at government expenditure and goes into those areas that will benefit the poor, I'm talking about health, talking about education, then you expect that at least the vulnerable will also benefit.
I hear you say, I mean, because we're talking about manifestos, is that if you're monitoring and want to pay attention to whether a manifesto is effective, pay attention to where they are planning to spend the money if they win power.
And Professor Magashi mentioned that.
Okay, great. Let me give him a final word because we just have less than a minute to wrap up. Professor Magashi, wrap it up for me. What will be your key points to note in this conversation as we wrap up? We have a minute.
Oh, again, has to do with fiscal responsibility. And I also think that it has to do with having an efficient public sector, because we always say that the state has to create a conducive environment. Well, that conducive environment requires an efficient public sector, where if you want to get a permit, it's done quickly. You want to get land title, it's done quickly. So it doesn't help when, for example, we read in the papers that the Auditor General says there is a non-trivial proportion, maybe about 50% of people in the public sector or in the civil service who had fake economic certificates. Right? It's a sign of a state sector that is so efficient. In 2015, the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Fiscal, said that one reason they had budget overrun was because contractors will come and will tell them that these items are not in the budget, but we will do it for you. We will go ahead with this project so that you pay us later.
Yeah.
You see, that is not even sole sourcing. That is worse than sole sourcing. That is contractors themselves identify things that the government hasn't done, and they said, okay, we'll do it. So things like that, they just lead to a very chaotic economic environment. So that's what I would say, that we should be disciplined. And finally, when it comes to manifestos, parties can have about 30 promises in the manifesto, but we have to just focus on some of the key ones. For example, the Nanado's government is, to some extent, defined by the free SHS policy. They have so many promises, but that one defines them. So we have to focus on some big ones to hold them accountable
to them. Gentlemen, thank you very much. This is the first in the series. We'll come away again with another as we hope to build an informed electorate. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.